I have to say this, music from the 60s and 70s are probably my favorite decade. I not only learned how to play music, well, specifically the bass, play drums and guitar too. Yeah, I will say that even those instruments, the 60s and 70s, had a profound impact on me. It was a very diverse decade. You see in the 60s where it was sort of growing from all this diversity, all these guys that grew up playing classical and jazz and blues, and getting into the newer blues form, rock and roll. Some cats even had some gospel background or was influenced by that. You see how that all that stuff kind of, I mean, it was being defined in the 50s and all that. Actually, we can go take rock and roll back to the 40s if we're talking about especially the black history of rock and roll, which I'm working on. But I guess common era, I guess, when it comes to rock and roll, the 50s in that sense, because that's when I guess it crossed over or whatever. You see all these influences, but the 60s, it's almost like they were really, there's more distortion, obviously. You had people experimenting with not only the distortion part, but adding even other instruments, whether it be some of the instruments that they grew up off of, like classical arrangements and stuff like that, or sort of instruments that were unconventional, like, the Moog synthesizers or theremins and stuff like that. So you see all this stuff coming down where it's just like really eclectic and just really diverse. I mean, you gotta give it up to, I mean, shoot, there were the three bands that I think of from the 60s that really, I guess you can say, have more of a mainstream appeal. There's three. I would say the Beatles, definitely. Bob Dylan, even though I can't say that I'm a fan or anything. And then Sly and the Family Stone. And the reason I mention these three, excuse this siren, these people in the background. I mention them because of the social impact all three of those bands had, as well as the musical impact. Bob Dylan was probably the first one to really put the socially conscious lyrics in, modern pop music, or the modern pop music of that time. The Beatles, on the other hand, I could say they did that later, but they did something where they incorporated a lot of things, a lot of different kinds of music in their music that probably people didn't really know could happen. I mean, shoot, yeah, we could talk about the Wall of Sound and even Motown being diverse, but which a lot of those guys listened to. I mean, they were into, all the mods were into soul music and stuff. But you can tell, like, especially like in the mid 60s, in the late 60s, it was just ahead. They took a lot of different elements from either Indian music and classical music, of course, jazz and folk, and put that in there. Sly and the Family Stone did that even more on a raw level, where they took that Motown sound and that nice drive and sort of vibe that was coming up, like for like a kind of a driving rock and roll soul, and made what became even funk. It was kind of hard to describe what they did, but they also had a socially conscious message. All three of those bands or artists did that, and they set the tone. Of course, I have to give props to the more underground bands. Well, Frank Zappa wasn't that underground. I mean, but he wasn't the Beatles, But he was one of those guys too that was very diverse when it came to just giving mad props to like all kinds of different. I mean, he took his composer avant-garde way of looking at things with his, into Edgar Varese and all that stuff, and just the way that he composed and put that in, rock and roll, R&B, doo-wop, whatever he did, and put it all together. All of his pieces were pretty funny too. I like the way that he kind of manipulated even some classical tunes, like what he did with the Whole Planets and that song Colony Vegetable, or what he did with Stravinsky's Rite of Spring and Plastic People. But then you also had other bands like the Fugs from New York, and another LA band called the United States of America that was definitely avant-garde, way ahead of their time, and probably more underground than any band back then. Strawberry Alarm Clock, love Music Machine. I'm mentioning mostly LA bands. Of course, the East Coast, you know, Velvet Underground and all that. Um, the Silver Apples. In the late 70s, things became a lot louder. I'm sorry, the late 60s, things became a lot louder. You had, of course, the mid to late 60s, you had like the Yardbirds. I guess I'm mentioning popular bands. I know that there's a lot of other bands because I listen to like a lot of stuff from that time. I mentioned a few others, Love and the Music Machine. They're probably not as known more as the Yardbirds or, you know, man, what's the other band? The Kinks. But they still, I mean, they were louder. Around 66, that was, everybody just got louder with the guitars and the Who and all them, you know, like. Then you had bands like Cream and Hendrix, man, like really set it off. It's one thing to go louder, but it's another thing to really expand, you know, the sound and do things that people couldn't, still to this day can't really put Hendrix in a category, which is good. And I mean, man, him, Cream, I mentioned them. There's a slew of others, Vanilla Fudge in America, and more. I mean, man, I could talk about this, but I'm gonna do a part 2 to this and go from the late 60s to the early 70s. Peace.